They say every marriage has its seasons. Ours had seen the bloom of spring, the warmth of summer, and perhaps now the chill of a long, creeping winter. We've been together for 12 years, Olivia and I. A couple of kids, a mortgage, and a suburban life that most would envy. But lately, something was off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Olivia had always been a whirlwind of energy, smart, beautiful, and full of life. That was part of what drew me to her in the first place. But lately, her energy had seemed redirected. Our conversations felt hollow, her attention elsewhere. Late-night phone notifications, a sudden penchant for dressing up even for mundane errands. It all seemed harmless on the surface, but it gnawed at me. One day, I took a half-day from work, deciding to surprise her with dinner. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just a quiet evening together like we used to have. But when I walked into the kitchen, her work bag sitting on the counter caught my eye. The zipper was partially open, revealing a sliver of its contents. Normally, I wouldn't snoop, but something compelled me to look inside. Among the clutter was a receipt from a high-end boutique downtown. The name scribbled on it wasn't mine, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Thanks for a wonderful lunch. Can't wait to see you again. John. The name was innocuous enough, but the tone of the note wasn't. I stood there, gripping the receipt, my mind spinning with questions. Could it be a misunderstanding? A mix-up? No. The phrasing was deliberate, personal. This wasn't a casual thank you. Suddenly, the sound of the front door opening broke my trance. Olivia's voice called out, cheerful and unsuspecting. I quickly zipped up her bag and placed it back where it was, forcing a neutral expression onto my face as she walked in. That evening, Olivia was animated, chatting away about her day as though nothing was amiss. But her words barely registered. My mind kept circling back to that receipt, to the name John and what he might mean to her. She mentioned a long lunch break, describing it casually as part of her busy schedule. I noticed the faintest pause before she said it, a hesitation that might have gone unnoticed if I weren't scrutinizing her every word. I responded with polite interest, not wanting to tip her off. But inside, I felt the fire of suspicion growing. The more normal she seemed, the more wrong it felt. After dinner, I busied myself with tidying up while Olivia disappeared into the bathroom. When I saw her phone sitting on the nightstand, unlocked, a pang of guilt made me hesitate. But the need for answers outweighed it. Her messages were filled with the mundane exchanges of work and friends, but one thread stood out. It was with a contact labeled simply J. Their messages weren't overtly flirtatious, but there was a rhythm to them that felt too intimate, too familiar. One message in particular made my breath catch. Can't stop thinking about today. Let's do it again soon. I heard the bathroom door open and quickly placed the phone back, returning to my spot on the bed with my Kindle. She came out, toweling her hair, and asked if I was coming to bed. I nodded, my tone steady even as my thoughts churned. That night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling. Whatever was happening, I needed to know. The questions burned too fiercely to ignore. The next morning, I woke up with a singular focus. Find out the truth. Olivia was already up, rushing through her routine before heading out the door. She kissed me on the cheek, a fleeting touch that now felt hollow, and wished me a good day. I muttered a response, keeping my tone as casual as I could manage. The moment her car pulled out of the driveway, I sprang into action. Time was limited before I had to head to the office, but every second counted. Her laptop was my first target, but it was password protected, and my attempts to guess it went nowhere. Her work bag offered little, save for her planner, tucked away like it held state secrets. Flipping through it, I noticed a recurring entry. Lunch every Thursday, labeled simply with a J. There was again, that letter staring back at me like a taunt. My jaw tightened as I closed the planner and slid it back into her bag. I turned to technology, leveraging my background in programming to set up a tracker on her phone. The app had been installed discreetly while she showered the night before. Now, it would feed me her location in real time. I hated what I was doing. It felt invasive, wrong, but my doubt was too big to ignore. Later at work, I pulled up the tracker during a coffee break. Her location pinged at the office, exactly where it should have been, but when lunchtime rolled around, her dot shifted to a downtown cafe. It wasn't her usual spot, and the change prickled my nerves. By the time I checked again an hour later, her location had moved to a boutique hotel nearby. A hotel. My chest tightened, and my mind raced with excuses. Maybe it was work-related. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe it wasn't. I couldn't focus on anything after that. The questions gnawed at me until I finally told my boss I wasn't feeling well and left early. Driving into the city, I parked a few blocks from the hotel, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what I was expecting or dreading to see. For an hour, I sat there watching the entrance like a hawk. At first, there was nothing. The steady flow of guests and staff didn't include anyone familiar. I began second-guessing myself, wondering if I'd overreacted. Then the door opened, and there she was. Olivia stepped out, walking beside a tall, well-dressed man who looked like he belonged in a high-rise corner office. His air of confidence made my stomach churn, and the way Olivia laughed at something he said, her hand briefly brushing his arm, was a knife twisting in my gut. They didn't linger. He hailed a cab, and she waved goodbye, her smile soft and lingering. It wasn't the smoking gun I feared or hoped for, but it was enough to shatter something inside me. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind swirling with indecision. Confronting her now would be premature. Following her wouldn't change what I'd seen. What I needed was undeniable proof. Something more than a cryptic note. More than vague messages or a lingering touch. I needed the truth, laid bare. The drive home felt endless, the silence in the car filled with possibilities I didn't want to face. Every excuse I could conjure felt thin, fragile. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the daylight was nearly gone, long shadows stretching over the house that now felt foreign to me. When Olivia walked in that evening, she was radiant, her cheeks flushed, her laughter too bright. It was as if she were glowing from some unseen spark. I watched her closely, noting how she seemed lighter, more carefree than I'd seen in years. She asked about my day, her voice tinged with an unfamiliar warmth. I responded with practiced calm, my smile forced. Inside, I was anything but steady. The image of her leaving that hotel with another man replayed in my mind like a cruel refrain, her laughter there as bright as it was now. Confronting her felt impossible without proof. I knew how it would play out. She'd deny, deflect, twist the conversation until I'd be the one apologizing. I couldn't risk that. That night, after she fell asleep, I took the next step. I retrieved a small camera I'd ordered earlier in the week, one I never imagined needing, but now couldn't do without. Discreet, wireless, motion-activated, it was my best chance to see what happened when I wasn't around. I installed the first camera in the living room, angling it to capture the front door and any interactions that might happen there. The second went into her car, tucked neatly near the dashboard. It felt surreal, setting up surveillance in my own home, but I needed to know. The next few days passed in a fog. Olivia's routine didn't change, but I observed her differently now. Every smile felt calculated, every touch rehearsed. I dissected her actions like a puzzle, searching for the pieces that didn't fit. The more normal she seemed, the more deeply I doubted her. Midweek, the first piece of evidence appeared. Reviewing the footage from her car, I found a conversation recorded while she was parked outside a cafe. Her voice was soft, warm, intimate in a way that made my chest tighten. She confirmed plans to meet someone, the name John slipping out like a dagger. There it was, the man behind the mysterious J. The next day, I tracked her movements again. Sure enough, her location pinged at the same boutique hotel. This time, I drove to the area, parking a safe distance away and waiting. An hour later, she walked out with him. John. I recognized him instantly, tall, polished, exuding the kind of confidence that set my teeth on edge. As they walked to their cars, his hand brushed her back briefly, casually. It was a gesture so small, yet it carried the weight of their connection. I snapped photos with my phone, each click of the shutter driving the betrayal deeper into my chest. When Olivia came home that night, I played the role of the devoted husband. I kissed her on the cheek, listened as she recounted her day, and even told her I loved her before bed. The words tasted bitter, but I needed time to finish what I'd started. What struck me most wasn't just the betrayal. It was the ease with which she navigated her double life. She carried it effortlessly, as though the years we'd shared were just a role she could step out of when it suited her. But her game was coming to an end. By the time Friday arrived, I felt like I was living in a noir film, watching, waiting, piecing together fragments of a puzzle I wished didn't exist. The evidence was piling up, the patterns clear. Regular lunches with John, discreet visits to the boutique hotel, and a flurry of late-night messages exchanged when she thought I was asleep. What struck me most was her ability to act as if nothing was wrong. That evening at dinner, she sat across from me, smiling warmly, asking about my day, as if the threads of deception weren't unraveling right in front of her. Her tone was calm, her demeanor unassuming, but everything about her felt like a lie. I responded with short, measured answers, mirroring her calm to avoid suspicion. She spoke about work, some new campaign she was excited about, but all I could focus on was the ease with which she slipped between these two worlds. How many lies had she told me? How long had she been carrying on like this? Looking me in the eye with the same smile she likely gave him. Later that night, when she was asleep, I checked her phone again. A new message thread with John caught my attention. The words on the screen made my chest tighten, his compliments, her flirtatious responses, the casual intimacy of their exchange. These weren't just stolen moments. They were building a life within a life, a connection that excluded me entirely. I couldn't confront her yet. Not until I had something undeniable, something that couldn't be twisted or explained away. I decided to escalate. The next day, I contacted a private investigator I'd found online. Paul was his name, a professional with experience in unraveling situations like mine. At our meeting in a quiet coffee shop, he listened carefully, taking notes as I laid out everything I discovered so far. Paul was practical, almost clinical. He explained that confronting her without irrefutable evidence would only make things messy. What I needed was more: photographs, recordings, anything that couldn't be denied. He reassured me that he'd get to work immediately. "Leave it to me," he said, outlining his plan to follow her and document everything. By Monday morning, Paul was fully operational, tracking Olivia's every move while I went through the motions of normal life. Pretending that nothing was wrong was exhausting, but I knew the charade was necessary. That evening, Paul sent me his first update. He'd spotted Olivia and John together again, this time at an intimate restaurant. The attached photos showed them seated across from each other at a candlelit table, leaning in close, their hands brushing. I stared at the images, my stomach churning. There it was, the confirmation I dreaded but couldn't look away from. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion, no longer an abstract fear. It was real, and I couldn't escape it. The weight of the evidence was becoming unbearable. The photos, messages, and locations painted a picture I wished I could unsee. Every interaction with Olivia now felt like a quiet war, what I knew against what she believed I didn't. Confronting her without undeniable proof would give her the upper hand, and I wasn't about to let that happen. On Tuesday evening, I came home earlier than usual. Olivia sat on the couch, flipping through a magazine, her smile bright when she noticed me. It was the kind of smile that once made me feel like the luckiest man alive. Now it felt rehearsed, hollow. She asked if everything was all right, her tone light, and mentioned she'd made lasagna, my favorite, for dinner. I watched her as she moved around the kitchen, humming softly while she worked. It was all so painfully normal, her actions those of a wife who cared, a partner invested in her family. But it was impossible not to see the disconnect. I asked if she'd been all right lately, noting that she seemed distracted. Her response came easily, as though she'd rehearsed it 100 times. "Stress at work," she said. "Nothing to worry about." Her smile faltered for just a moment, a crack in her facade that vanished as quickly as it appeared. I nodded, pretending to accept her answer. But inside I seethed. How could she stand there, cooking dinner like nothing had changed, while I pieced together the truth of her betrayal? The days that followed were a blur of routine and vigilance. I tracked her movements with the app on her phone, watching as she moved through her predictable pattern. Work, the cafe, the boutique hotel. The consistency made it easier to prepare myself for what I'd find, but it didn't make it any less painful. By Friday evening, Paul called with the update I'd been waiting for. His voice was steady, professional, as he outlined what he'd uncovered. He had everything: photos, timestamps, and even a recording of a conversation between Olivia and John. She was planning a weekend getaway with him, telling him she'd spin it as a work retreat. The mention of the getaway drained the blood from my face. She wasn't just sneaking moments with him anymore. She was making plans to leave me and the kids behind for an entire weekend. Paul's advice was simple but powerful. Stay calm, stick to the facts, and let her talk herself into a corner. He emailed me the full report that night, a detailed dossier of her deceit, and as I reviewed it, my anger sharpened into something focused and cold. This wasn't just infidelity. It was an act of cruelty, a calculated betrayal. She wasn't just lying to me. She was lying to everyone, wearing the mask of the devoted wife while quietly dismantling everything we'd built together. Tomorrow, her lies would unravel. Saturday morning arrived heavy with purpose. Olivia moved around the kitchen, humming softly as she sipped her coffee. Her overnight bag sat by the door, ready for the work retreat she had insisted her office was hosting. The sight of it sent a pang through my chest, a cruel reminder of how easily she lied. She seemed cheerful, even warm, as she mentioned that dinner was prepped in the fridge and that she planned to video call the kids before bed. Her words were practiced, her demeanor effortless, but every syllable stung. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she grabbed it quickly, typing a response before tucking it into her purse. Her movements were casual, almost carefree, but they didn't match the tension coiled in my chest. The lie was right there, glaring at me, but I bit my tongue. Instead, I managed to smile, kissed her on the cheek, and wished her a safe trip. The moment her car disappeared down the street, I sprang into action. The groundwork had already been laid, every piece carefully planned for what was to come. When I arrived at the hotel, I parked out of sight, my phone buzzing with confirmation from Paul. She checked in with John less than 15 minutes earlier, heading straight to room 212. My hands trembled as I made my way through the lobby, but I forced myself to stay composed. The receptionist barely glanced at me as I walked to the elevator, though I felt as if every step echoed my purpose. Outside room 212, I paused, listening. Laughter drifted through the door, muffled but unmistakable. My stomach twisted, the final shred of hope that I was wrong evaporating. I knocked. There was a pause, then footsteps. When the door opened a crack, Olivia's face appeared, her expression shifting from confusion to shock. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Her hesitation said everything. I pushed the door open, stepping inside before she could react. The room was painfully ordinary, its intimacy a stark contrast to the betrayal it contained. John was seated on the edge of the bed, his face pale as he realized who I was. The words spilled from her in a rush, excuses and denials tangled together. I didn't let her finish. The photos, the texts, the recordings. I had everything. I told her to stop, my voice steady but sharp. Her defenses crumbled, the bravado she'd worn so easily replaced with desperation. When I demanded to know how long this had been going on, her answer came quietly, almost inaudible. Months. The admission hit like a blow, confirming what I already knew but didn't want to believe. John tried to speak, offering some flimsy excuse, but I silenced him with a glare. He was irrelevant to me, another piece of a puzzle I hadn't asked for. I turned back to Olivia, my voice cold as I laid out the reality she now had to face. She would come home the next day and explain herself to the kids. And then it was over. Divorce papers would be filed on Monday. She begged, her tears falling freely, promises tumbling out about ending it with John and fixing what was broken. But I was past that point. Her choices had made it clear. This wasn't something that could be repaired. Without another word, I turned and walked out, leaving her and John behind. The drive home felt surreal. My grip on the steering wheel was so tight my knuckles ached, but I barely noticed. My thoughts raced with disbelief and anger, circling the same unanswerable questions. How had it come to this? How had the woman I built a life with become someone I barely recognized? When I pulled into the driveway, the house was eerily quiet. The kids were at my parents' for the weekend, thankfully spared from the immediate aftermath of what had unfolded. I sank into the couch, staring blankly at the unlit TV screen, the weight of it all pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. Her tears, her promises to end it with him, her pleas for forgiveness, they all echoed hollowly in my mind. If she'd cared about me, about our family, she wouldn't have started the affair in the first place. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder Paul had sent, the photos, the texts, the recordings. It was all there, each piece of evidence cutting deeper the longer I looked at it. I knew I'd need it for the divorce, but seeing it now felt like reliving the betrayal. An hour later, the sound of the front door creaking open snapped me out of my thoughts. Olivia stepped inside, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen. She froze when she saw me sitting there, her hesitation hanging thick in the air. She tried to speak, her voice trembling as she apologized and asked to talk. She perched nervously on the edge of the chair across from me, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Her words came haltingly, filled with sorrow and pleas to make things right. She spoke of love, of regret, of not wanting to lose the family we'd built. Her words barely registered. How could she talk of love after what she'd done? I stayed silent for a long time, letting her words trail off into the room. Finally, I spoke, my tone sharp but steady. It wasn't just me she'd betrayed. It was our entire family. I told her I couldn't understand how she could carry on this lie for months, how she could sneak away to him while I was at work, trusting her, raising our children. Her tears flowed freely, her voice breaking as she admitted her mistakes. She begged for another chance, promising to prove she could change. But the anger that had burned so fiercely earlier in the day gave way to something colder now. Exhaustion. I told her this wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice repeated over and over. The damage wasn't something that could be undone with promises or tears. I asked her how she thought I could explain this to the kids, how I could tell them their mother had lied and destroyed the home we'd built together. Her sobs filled the room, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. I ended the conversation by telling her she could stay through the weekend, but come Monday morning, I'd be meeting with the lawyer to file the divorce papers. This wasn't up for debate. She had made her choice, and now she would have to live with it. As I stood to leave, she called after me, her voice desperate, but I didn't stop. The door to the guest room closed behind me, shutting out her muffled cries. Lying there in the dark, my mind refused to quiet. Grief tangled with relief in a confusing mix that left me wide awake. The life I had known was over. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance to build something new. Sunday morning arrived with a crushing stillness. I woke early, though not from necessity, and spent what felt like hours staring at the ceiling. The silence in the house pressed down on me, amplifying every thought and regret until they were impossible to ignore. When I finally made my way to the kitchen, Olivia was already there. She sat at the table, her coffee untouched, her eyes swollen from the night before. The air between us was thick, heavy with the weight of things unsaid. She glanced at me when I entered, her lips parting slightly as if to speak, but nothing came out. I poured myself coffee in silence, not offering any words either. The kids were due back from my parents' house in a few hours. That thought clung to me like a lead weight. How could I face them? How could I shatter their world with the truth of what was happening? When the time came to pick them up, Olivia insisted on riding with me. The drive was tense, filled with long pauses and unspoken glances. A few times, she started to speak, but I cut her off with a shake of my head. Whatever she had to say, it wasn't the time. Back home, the kids burst into the house, their energy a stark contrast to the gloom hanging over us. They were full of stories about their weekend at Grandma's, their laughter and chatter temporarily masking the weight of what lay ahead. For a moment, I let myself get lost in their joy, almost forgetting what had to be done. But then Olivia disappeared into the bedroom, and the reality of it all came rushing back. I sat the kids down in the living room, my heart pounding as I searched for the right words. They were still young, too young to grasp the full extent of what was happening, but they deserved a version of the truth that they could understand. With a voice thick from emotion, I told them that their mom and I had been having some problems and that we decided it was best to take some time apart. The words felt hollow even as I said them, but there was no way to soften the blow. Ellie's face crumpled immediately, her question cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Were we getting divorced? I hesitated, swallowing the lump in my throat, and told her the truth. Yes, we were. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Jake, still too young to fully grasp the situation, looked confused, his small brow furrowing as he tried to piece it together. Ellie, on the other hand, erupted into tears, crying out in frustration and disbelief. She asked why we couldn't just fix it, why things couldn't go back to the way they were. I reached for her, pulling her into a hug and holding her tightly as she sobbed against me. I told her I wished it were that simple, but some things couldn't be repaired. Jake climbed into Olivia's lap, still looking to her for comfort, though he didn't say much. Olivia knelt beside me, taking Ellie's hand, her voice breaking as she reassured them that we both loved them more than anything and would do everything possible to make this easier for them. Ellie didn't respond, her tears soaking into my shirt, while Jake leaned into Olivia, seeking comfort in the only way he knew how. As we held them, I felt an overwhelming wave of anger and sadness. This wasn't just my pain anymore, it was theirs too. Olivia's choices had dragged us all into this, and the cracks in our family were now impossible to ignore. The moments stretched endlessly, the kids' cries filling the room as Olivia and I held them. I knew then that there was no going back. Nothing would ever be the same. Sunday passed in a blur of tension and sadness. The kids stayed close, their confusion palpable. Ellie barely spoke, retreating to her room after dinner, while Jake clung to Olivia, holding on to her like he feared she might disappear. I tried to focus on the practical, packing a bag, coordinating with my lawyer, making a checklist for the week ahead. But no amount of planning could block out the quiet heaviness that had settled over our home. That night, after the kids were finally asleep, Olivia approached me in the kitchen. She stood hesitantly by the counter, her posture tentative, as though afraid to speak. Her presence alone was enough to tighten the knot in my chest. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was soft, almost pleading. She wanted to know if there was any chance we could fix things for the kids, for us. Her words came haltingly, layered with guilt and regret, as she spoke about the mistakes she'd made and the hope she still had for our family. I set the papers I'd been reviewing down and turned to meet her gaze. The tears in her eyes mirrored the ones I'd seen so many times over the last few days, but they didn't move me anymore. I asked her how she could believe this was fixable. Her response was desperate, a litany of willingness, counseling, therapy, anything to prove that she could make things right. But it wasn't enough. It couldn't be enough. I leaned back against the counter, folding my arms as I reminded her that this wasn't a simple mistake. It was a series of choices, repeated over and over again, each one breaking the trust we had built. The betrayal wasn't a single moment. It was a pattern. She admitted she hated herself for what she'd done, but insisted she had never stopped loving me. Her words were meant to heal, but they landed like another blow. I couldn't understand how she could call this love. The lies, the deceit, the selfishness of it all. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us thicker than any argument could have been. I finally broke it, telling her that I couldn't live like this anymore. The kids deserved better, and so did I. Her tears came harder now, but I didn't reach out to comfort her. She asked what would happen to the kids, how we would explain this to them, how we could keep their lives from falling apart. I told her the truth. We would do what we could. We would stay civil, co-parent, and try to create a sense of stability. But the illusion that this could be fixed was just that, an illusion. It was too far gone. Her shoulders slumped as the last bit of fight seemed to leave her. She murmured that she would move out, stay with her sister for a while. I agreed that it was probably for the best. As she turned and walked away, I felt a strange pang. It wasn't love or forgiveness, just a faint echo of what we used to have, a life that felt so far removed now. But I didn't call her back. The house grew still again, the silence wrapping around me like a shroud. I stood there for a long time, wondering how we'd let it all come to this. Monday dawned heavy and gray, the sky mirroring the weight in my chest. By the time I woke, Olivia was already gone. She had left early, sparing the kids from seeing her pack. A note sat on the counter, full of apologies I barely skimmed before crumpling it and tossing it in the trash. I focused on the kids that morning, trying to keep some semblance of normalcy. Ellie ate her cereal in silence, her gaze darting away when I tried to catch her eye. Jake, oblivious to the tension, peppered me with questions about whether Olivia would still be home later. I explained gently that she'd gone to stay with Aunt Sarah for a little while, emphasizing that it was just time to think. Jake nodded, accepting the explanation without protest, but Ellie wasn't as easily appeased. Her voice cut through the stillness, flat but full of hurt as she accused me of lying, her sharp eyes searching for cracks in my calm. She pushed her bowl away and stormed out of the kitchen before I could respond, the sound of her door slamming echoing through the house. Jake, watching from his seat, slipped off his chair and reached for my hand. His small fingers wrapped around mine, his voice soft as he reassured me that Ellie was just mad and would be okay. I squeezed his hand, managing a strained smile before sending him off to get his backpack. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. I dropped the kids at school, then met with my lawyer, Karen. Her tone was brisk and professional as she explained the next steps, outlining everything from the filing process to custody arrangements. The evidence I'd gathered left no room for argument. There would be no issues with the divorce proceedings. Signing the papers felt surreal, like the final act in a life I no longer recognized. By the time I returned home, the house felt emptier than ever. Olivia's favorite mug was missing from the counter, and the throw blanket she always draped over the couch was nowhere to be seen. Ellie stayed in her room, a silent presence behind a closed door, while Jake colored quietly at the dining table. When I sat across from him, he held up a picture of a rocket ship, explaining that he'd made it for me because he knew I was sad. His words hit me harder than any accusation, and I pulled him into a hug, whispering my thanks and telling him how much I loved him. For a brief moment, I felt like I could handle this, like rebuilding might be possible, if only for their sake. But as the day wore on, the weight of it all crept back in, settling into my chest like a stone. That night, after the kids were asleep, I sat alone in the living room, scrolling through old photos. Birthdays, vacations, lazy Sunday mornings. All reminders of a life that now felt distant and irretrievable. I'd poured everything into loving Olivia, and now all that love felt like it had disappeared into a void, leaving me hollow. Tuesday morning arrived as heavy and slow as Monday had been. I got the kids ready for school, enduring Ellie's pointed glares and Jake's endless questions about when things would go back to normal. Normal. The word felt foreign now, like a concept that no longer applied to us. After dropping them off, I returned to the house to find my phone buzzing on the counter. Olivia's name flashed across the screen, unexpected and unwelcome. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me. Her voice, tentative and unsure, filled the line as she asked how the kids were doing. She apologized, her words unsteady, as she tried to explain how sorry she was for everything that had happened. There was an edge of desperation to her tone, a need to bridge the gap she had created. I kept my answer short, unwilling to offer her the comfort she sought. Ellie's upset, I told her, but what did she expect? Olivia's sigh on the other end of the line was shaky, full of regret, as she said she hadn't wanted things to end this way. Her insistence that she was willing to do anything to fix things for the kids, for us, stirred something sharp in me. I let out a bitter laugh, unable to hold back the anger bubbling beneath the surface. Fix this? The choices she'd made had already shattered what we had. Her voice broke as she admitted she hated herself for what she'd done, but she couldn't give up on us. She wouldn't. For a moment, a flicker of something surfaced in me. Anger, pity, maybe even longing for the life we'd lost. But forgiveness? That was a bridge I couldn't cross. I told her as much, my voice steady as I reminded her that she had made her choices, and now we all had to live with the consequences. If she truly cared about fixing this, she wouldn't have let it get to this point. Her silence stretched between us, her breathing uneven. Finally, she whispered that she would keep trying, if not for us, then for the kids. There was a part of me that wanted to believe her, to cling to the idea of rebuilding something from the ashes. But the rational part of me knew better. It was too late. I told her so, explaining that while I do everything possible to make the transition easier for the kids, as far as we were concerned, it was over. Her response came quietly, a resigned acknowledgement that left me with a sense of finality. I ended the call, without waiting for a goodbye, tossing the phone onto the couch. My hands trembled as I sat there, my chest tightening under the weight of it all. For the first time since everything had unraveled, I felt like I'd drawn a line in the sand, a boundary that couldn't be crossed. The days after my call with Olivia were a strange mix of lightness and heaviness. Lighter, because I had finally set a firm boundary, making it clear that this was the end. Heavier, because now I had to face what that actually meant. Ellie remained distant, barely speaking to me unless absolutely necessary. Around Jake, she managed to keep a brave face, but her anger was evident in the way she avoided me. I knew she blamed me for the separation, and though I wanted to tell her the full truth, I held back. For now, shielding them from the worst of it felt more important than setting the record straight. Work became my escape. I buried myself in projects, staying late at the office to avoid the hollow silence of the house. The kids spent their afternoons at friends' houses or extracurriculars, leaving me with a solitude I hadn't experienced in years. It was strange and unwelcome, but it also gave me clarity. One evening I sat down and made a list, not a to-do list, but a roadmap for how to rebuild. The divorce, finding a therapist for the kids, moving into a new house, and figuring out what moving on could look like. The act of planning gave me a sense of control, something I hadn't felt since discovering Olivia's betrayal. By midweek, the first item on the list was complete. My lawyer called to confirm that the divorce filing had been processed and served. Olivia hadn't contested anything, which was both a relief and a bitter reminder of how far apart we had grown. That night, as I packed up old photo albums, Ellie appeared in the doorway. Her voice was small when she asked if the divorce was really happening. I motioned for her to sit beside me, surprised she was even willing to talk. When I told her the truth, she pressed me, asking why forgiveness wasn't an option. Her questions were heartbreaking, especially when she asked if I still loved Olivia. I explained as best I could that love didn't always mean things could be fixed. Ellie didn't respond right away, her thoughtful silence making her seem older than her years. When she finally spoke, she admitted she didn't want to pick sides. I pulled her into a hug, reassuring her that she didn't have to. For the first time in days, she leaned into me, letting her guard down just a little. She confessed her fear of us being broken as a family. I told her we weren't broken, just trying to figure out a new way to be whole. By the weekend, life began to feel somewhat routine, though the undercurrent of change remained impossible to ignore. Olivia called each evening to check on the kids, her tone cautious and careful. I kept the conversations brief, sticking strictly to updates about Ellie and Jake. Saturday morning, I took the kids to the park. Jake raced to the playground, his laughter ringing out as he climbed the jungle gym, while Ellie hung back on a bench, scrolling through her phone. Sitting beside her, I asked if she was okay. She shrugged, her gaze still fixed on her screen, before admitting that everything felt strange without Olivia at home. I told her it felt strange for me too, but assured her we'd figure it out. She looked at me then, her eyes searching mine, and asked if life would ever feel normal again. I told her the truth. The normal we once knew was gone, but a new kind of normal was possible. Her small, hesitant smile felt like a step forward. That evening, over pizza at the dining table, Ellie seemed lighter. She even laughed at Jake's antics and cracked a few jokes of her own. For the first time in weeks, the weight in the air felt like it might lift. But then my phone buzzed with a message from Olivia, asking if she could come by to see the kids the next day. I stared at the screen, my appetite disappearing. As much as I wanted to keep things simple, I couldn't deny her time with them. Reluctantly, I agreed, making it clear I didn't want any unnecessary drama. The next morning, I cleaned the house, more out of habit than anything else, and prepared the kids for Olivia's visit. When she arrived, she looked different, tired, as if the weight of her choices had finally settled on her. The kids greeted her eagerly. Jake threw his arms around her, while Ellie hung back, watching cautiously. I stayed in the background, torn between wanting to leave them space and feeling the need to stay close. For an hour, I observed as she reconnected with them. Her questions about school and offers to help with lunch felt genuine, though the distance between us remained. When Jake asked when she was coming back home, the room fell silent. Olivia glanced at me for help, and I quickly stepped in, explaining gently that she was staying with Aunt Sarah for now, but would still see them often. Jake seemed disappointed, but accepted the explanation. Ellie, however, watched the exchange with sharp, assessing eyes. As Olivia left later that afternoon, she paused at the door to thank me for letting her visit. I didn't respond, simply nodding as she walked away. One visit down, I thought as I closed the door. 1,000 more to go. The weeks that followed were an emotional roller coaster. Some days felt close to normal, with the kids laughing and playing as if nothing had changed. Other days, the weight of the divorce loomed heavily over everything. Ellie's anger surfaced in bursts, while Jake's questions often left me fumbling for answers. Olivia continued her visits, focusing solely on the kids. She no longer pressed me to talk about fixing things between us, and I was grateful for the shift. Whatever feelings remained, trust between us was irreparably broken. One Saturday morning, I was in the garage packing boxes when Ellie came out to join me. She perched on a nearby stool, watching quietly before asking what I was doing. When I explained that I was preparing for a move to a smaller place nearby, her brow furrowed in concern. After a pause, she asked if I thought things would get better. Setting the box down, I sat beside her and answered honestly. I told her it would take time, but I truly believed we'd be okay. She looked at me with uncertainty, then asked if I was mad at her for being upset with me. I smiled and pulled her into a hug, reassuring her that I could never be angry with her for struggling with everything that had happened. That evening, after the kids were asleep, I sat in the quiet living room, reflecting on how far we'd come. The betrayal and heartbreak still lingered, but the pain felt less raw now. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future not defined by Olivia's choices. I didn't know exactly what it would look like, but I was certain it would be honest, real, and mine. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, a fragile flicker of hope settled in my chest. Maybe this wasn't the end after all.